Alright guys, welcome back. Today is Easter Sunday, and I have a bit of a special episode for you. So, I'm going to be taking a nice walk on this beautiful Sunday afternoon. Sunday, the day of rest. Wait! And we're going to be talking about the name of the channel. So, Doth or Doth data. Now, I'm sure many of you are not familiar with what Doth is, or Doth, depending on how you pronounce it. So for starters, it's a part of the Kabbalah. So the Kabbalah, put simply, is a tool used by authentic Jewish tradition, usually Jewish mystic tradition, to explain the divine emanations of how God created reality and how reality is manifest through God. Now, sitting outside of the tree of life, that's what the Kabbalah is the tree of life, is the three kind of formlessnesses of God. So these are the emptiness that God can even begin to manifest through. And they are labeled as Ein, Ein Sof, and Ein Sof And these three dimensions of dimensionlessness, you can think about them as Ein is a single point without any data. You can think of Ein Sof as all of the possible lines that could exist in a two-dimensional plane, but without any data. It's almost like the structure, like a sponge, almost like a shell or a jelly kind of thing. And then Ein Sof is the three-dimensional formlessness. So think about all of three-dimensional space without anything there, without even time as a reference unit. And so from that, the three kind of formlessnesses is where Kether can emerge. And Kether is the crown. It's the first Sephirah, which just means it's the first divine emanation of God. And this is basically pure unity. It's not nothingness in the sense that there's nothing there, like Ein Sof, Ter. But Kether is the crown of all union, where you can't really discriminate between anything that is and anything that isn't there. So, if Kether is the crown, it's a pure unity. It's what Leibniz would refer to as the monad, the divine single unitary force, where everything in it is cohesive and anything in it can't be differentiated from anything else, because it all is perfect. It all is the most absolute, perfect, Platonic ideal land. And this is what the Gnostics would refer to as the pleroma. It's the land of beings, or the land of being. So, now that we have that kind of groundwork there, the next two Sephirah on the tree of life is Chokmah. Go easy on me. I'm a Westerner with the pronunciation. I don't speak Hebrew. But Chokmah is on the right side of the Kabbalah, and that is the pure kind of chaotic understandingness. It's the pure resourcefulness of interacting with the states of being. And then on the left side of the tree of life, in the first kind of hierarchy of it, below Kether, is Bina, which Bina is wisdom. Bina is the kind of graceful understanding. I'll dig more into this in their own right, but I'm just laying the groundwork to explain where Doth lies in this hierarchy. Now you might think these terms are a little bit abstract and a little bit out there, and why are we talking about this? Well, it's because it's a very handy toolkit to explain consciousness and reality, and this is why it's continued throughout the thousands of years of Jewish orthodoxy and Jewish mystical tradition. It's baked into a lot of authentic Jewish tradition. Not that you have to be Jewish to understand their cosmology, but it sure does help to know a little bit of their history. So, the next quote-unquote Sephiroth that isn't exactly a Sephiroth is Doth. And this is where the higher emanations of reality start to become real, in a sense that they are perceived by these unitary forms of consciousnesses. So the whole point of the channel being called Doth Data, or Doth Data, is the idea that consciousness, when these higher forms of emanation of creation, these higher forms of geometry and pattern and structure and order and unity and chaos, when these higher forms of God's expressiveness, think about mathematical formulas, think about the Fourier transform, think about harmonic series. A lot of these, what we call natural laws, only have value in a sense that there's a consciousness that can individually perceive and experience itself. And so Doth, as a Sephiroth, is not a Sephiroth because it's not a single individual aspect of creation. It's positioned between all of them. So all 10 Sephiroth cross through Doth, and it's very similar to the English word death, because that's kind of the tagline for what it really is it's death of any individual, and it's a reflection of all of them amongst itself. So, to put it plainly, Doth is the lens through which unitary consciousness, and what I mean by that is like you or me, or the thing that we call you or me, can actually perceive and observe and experience and interact with God in the higher planes, or if you want to use the word nature for the higher planes. So that's the main point I wanted to make. Point number one. Doth is this kind of empty waiting room. It's the vessel that is waiting to be filled with one of the divine emanations of God so that you might experience it. So that's point number one. Point number two, and I touched on this in my previous video, the difference between episteme and phronesis. So to recap there, episteme is knowledge. It's just pure, raw knowledge. Phronesis is the wisdom that comes from that knowledge. It's the practical application of the wisdom. So think about putting rats in a jar and shaking them up. You know, you can probably guess what would happen if you did that. We don't need a million studies about injecting rats with Ozempic and shaking them up in a jar. The practical wisdom comes in where you would tailor a study to be specific, applicable, and relevant to whatever you're trying to prove, rather than just doing something for the sake of pursuing raw knowledge and episteme. Phronesis is used to tailor in what we even do. And so Doth is the sphere where the other emanations of God can become real and can translate through their reflections into something meaningful. So all of the spheres of the Kabbalah, they exist on their own, but for them to really have that kind of practical use, practical application, they need to be translated into a lower plane. They need to cross through death. They need to cross through the bridge from being their pure, most abstract sense of themselves into something that is practical but might have flaws. So that is the second point. It's the difference between knowledge and understanding. And Da'at is that aha moment. It's the realization that what you have is it's a piece, it's a rung to climb to these higher degrees of understanding and these higher degrees of being. That's what Da'at is. So that was point number 2. Point number 3 is the union of opposites. So one thing central to God's purity is the fact that purity can only be pure. There's no corruption in an incorruptible existence. And this gets really stale and boring. And that's not what God is founded on. You know, in the Chinese tradition, they have the Bagua. The Bagua, or the, there's a Chinese, the trigram. It's all the different emanations of heaven. But another thing that you could use in Eastern philosophy to represent this is the yin and the yang. So within the yin, there is the yang. Within the yang, there is the yin. And so the unification of opposites, that is a central mechanism of Da'at. Old alchemical texts reference the process, the 7 or 14 different stages of alchemical transmutation. But the primary 3 alchemical symbols that you have across most of the literature is the salt, the sulfur, and the mercury. So salt is the base. Salt is the unification, the synthesis. Sulfur is the ascendant. It's the uprising, the uprooting, the inspiration. And mercury is the drawing downs, the solvent, the dissolver. Mercury is a liquid. And so you have those 3 different kind of, I believe they're called modalities if you're into astrology. Or is it cardinalities? No, cardinalities are 4. Modalities are 3. Triplicity is the word I'm looking for. But Da'at is special in the fact that the triplicity can manifest itself through the thesis, the antithesis, and the synthesis. And you can map those onto their alchemical correspondences. And you get the whole idea central to a lot of philosophies across the world, that as above, so below, to quote the Kabbalion, the old Hermetic Hermetic Trismegistus, Hermes Trismegistus, the thrice-born. That old philosophy centered in Egypt. And that's why Pythagoras was obsessed with triangles, the Pythagorean theorem, and all the geometry, the sacred geometry related to that. So that was point number 3, is that the unification of opposites, and this is what I was also getting at with the 1 + 1 = 5. Sometimes the sum of the parts can be greater than the whole, or the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. This is what's called a gestalt. I'll put a picture of a gestalt on the screen here so you can see what that looks like. But a gestalt it's a visual representation of the fact that sometimes the parts create something that is more together. So 1 + 1 is kind of like 5 in that sense. You don't need the whole, every single part to represent the whole. And so that's how Da'at is. You don't need to be able to hold every single divine emanation. You don't need to be able to hold a perfect understanding, a perfect wisdom, a perfect righteousness, a perfect courage to be able to get the point that this is what they should look like. So The unification of opposites is central to Doth. And that was point number 3. Point number 4 is that Doth, it's invisible on its own. It can only be experienced. It can't be transmitted through any sort of reading, any sort of knowledge, any sort of intellectualization of trying to, split it into the Aristotelian dialectic of is or is not. Aristotelian dialectic is just a fancy word to say that we split everything into this or that. We split everything into either it is or it isn't. We split everything into up or down, left or right, back or forward. And that's why the cube, that's why Saturn governs our physical plane. It's the furthest away. It's the 3 forms of 3-dimensionality. But the constraints are needed to have freedom, in a sense, that without constraints, freedom is meaningless. And without freedom, constraints are meaningless. They both need each other. And that's where that intersection comes into being. It can only be experienced. And this is why meditation is kind of important as well. So meditation can be a vehicle for you to fully immerse yourself into Doth. I like to bring up for the pure materialist listening, for the pure speculative materialist, I would like to propose this thought experiment to you. If this isn't really clicking, I'd like to ask you, what would death feel like? Everybody's so afraid of death, but from a pure, rational, materialist, logical perspective, you will never experience death. Because if we define death as the cessation of experience, then death is something that cannot be experienced. And this is something that I think a lot of German philosophers wrote about, like Schopenhauer or some other people. But anyway, if you can't experience death, then is it even real? Now, real is I'm using a lot of loaded terminology, and I'm kind of backtracking on the fact that I'm asking if something is, and that's using the Aristotelian dialectic. But Doth is experiencing a place beyond Aristotelian dialectic, a place beyond simple is or isn't, good or bad, up or down, beyond the state of dialectics or dyads. It's a triplicity. It's a 10th degree thing, because there's 10 Sephirah. That's the whole idea of the Kabbalah, the tree of life. It has 10 nodes. And so that's why I made a video about Malkuth-maxing. How do you actually get from being all up in your head and in the realm of ideas into actually doing and being? And so Malkuth-maxing, if you relate that to Hemi-Sync in the meditation exercises, it's really about that visualization training. It's about how can you manifest your future, but meaningfully manifest it, not just the crystal TikTok girly manifestation methods, but actual productive thought guiding exercises that can prepare you for creation. So, to wrap this back into the main point, I can go and ramble on and on and on about what Doth is and all of this, how good it is and how amazing and how it can do whatever for you. But the real point is that you ought to experience it for yourself. And I found that the fastest vehicle for that is meditation. And I figure that I could prepare some resources that can help you not get stuck on any individual Sephirah, any single rung on that ladder to climb up the tree of life. Because, that's the whole point of this existence here. It's to climb that tree. You'll notice that so many people find fleeting joys and fleeting temporal happiness. And this is what the Greeks had their whole mental breakdown about hedonism and just pursuing just pure physical pleasure as the highest good. And then Aristotle went and smacked them all with the idea of virtue. And a lot of debate on that for thousands of years. But the wisdom will guide you to that middle road. That's why Doth is centered not at the top, not at the bottom, not at the left, not at the right. It's centered at the pure absolute center of the tree of life. And that's where you begin to really experience the joy of being immersed in creation. So, take for example this nice sunny day. Absolutely beautiful. Now, if I lived in paradise and in Eden, in the perfect pure Garden of Eden, I wouldn't really think this is too beautiful. Think much of this. I would actually be kind of dissatisfied that, the sun is a little too hot or the wind's a little too cold, or that I'm, experiencing any sort of discomfort slightly from the sand or the gravel in my shoes or whatever. But it's through knowing the opposite that you can appreciate what you have. So that's why, people think a lot of bad things happen to them, or there's like, oh God, why me? And they don't really understand the fact that the bad experiences that you have in life are there intentionally for you to recognize the other side of that. Because how much more do you enjoy the nice sunny weather when it's been cold and blizzards and snowy? And then again, on the other side of that, how much more do you enjoy those nice cold rainy days if it's always the same sunny monotonous thing? That's where Doth, that's where that central core can help you gain that experience of the other through the other. So that was point number 4. Point number 5. Doth sits across the abyss. So in many traditions, Doth is the hidden Sephirah. It's the hidden sphere, because on its own it can't exist. It needs something to reflect through it. Think about a glass without any water. In many traditions, Doth is seen as this death, this valley. This is in Christian tradition, this is walking through the shadow in the valley of death, but you have no fear because the Lord is by my side. That's the whole idea that's with that. Why did Jesus have to go and fast in the desert for 40 days and get tempted by the serpent? Which, in a lot of cosmologies, the serpent represents that lightning bolt that strikes all the way from Kether the crown down to Malkuth. It's that divine inspiration, that divine spark. And that's kind of the lightning rod that draws it down, being able to defeat that serpent. Because the serpent will coil very tightly if you let it. Jesus, in Christian tradition, went through what's called kenosis. So kenosis is the process of emptying. And so this is a bit of a problem in a lot of Christian traditions, explaining Jesus' divinity and humanity. But central to many of their teachings is that, in fact, Jesus did go through a kenosis. He went through an emptying of to become fully human. And this is where he also, today's Easter Sunday, he rose up from the kenosis. But if you've ever wondered why in Christian tradition they say Jesus descended into hell, it's because that's the crossing in the Jewish, authentic Jewish Orthodox tradition. That crossing of Doth, that crossing of that valley of death and overcoming it. And so the archetypal story of Easter, how fitting it is Easter when I'm talking about Doth, is Jesus basically conquering Doth, conquering death. The whole archetypal story of Jesus conquering Doth, death, is where he recognizes and he transcends. Maybe recognizes isn't the right word, because Christ Logos already is, in the strict sense, pure divine being, but I won't get too far into the woods of that. The core idea here is that Doth is a valley that must be passed, and it I asked for some funny terms to make this relevant to our New Age people. Archon baiting. So what is archon baiting? In Gnostic cosmology, archons are these kind of lesser deities. They're these lesser energetic forces that trap souls in the physical world, and they convince people that physical reality is all there is. So, and they have different ones for each planet, and there's different levels of them. You can think about the Goetia, Solomon, the lesser key of Solomon, the Ars Goetia, and all the demons. So the Christian tradition likes to split up demons into different lower urges. So lust, wrath, pride, gluttony, and so on. And then there's subdivisions further. But in Gnostic cosmology, archons are the basically emanations of the creator, so the physical material world. And a lot of them will sit at the threshold for these new souls to come. And you'll see, when you get into meditation, you'll have a great session. You'll be perfect, clear of mind, and then a thought will come up of regret. Something you should have done, something you shouldn't have done. Something that hasn't settled in your mind and in your being. Something that you reject that's a part of you. And this is where the subtle and the practiced meditator will recognize this as just, if you're in a Christian tradition, one of Satan's little devils, or in a Gnostic cosmology, you'll recognize it as one of the archons being dispatched to pull you back down the tree of life. The point here being that Doth is heavily guarded. It's a very deep valley that you'll cross it when you're ready. And I'm just here to make sure that you have the tools and the know-how to do that when the time comes. Many people live their lives for that pure hedonistic satisfaction, like I was saying. And they'll get to the end of it, and they'll forget the whole point of it. You know, a life lived for the pure pursuit of pleasure is meaningful in its own way. It's as beautiful as a flower. But flowers are only beautiful because one day they won't be. One day they'll wilt. So a life that's lived for the pure pursuit of hedonistic pleasure, it's only as beautiful as it is in its heyday and in its prime. But you never want to see the husk that's left behind after it. And that's what social media likes to glamorize, is the heyday, the bloom, the dopamine hit, the shock and the awe. And where does it leave you? It leaves you with a husk afterward. Maybe I'll do a video on how there's an inverse to the tree of life. The clip-off. The clip-off are the divine husks, or they're divine-less husks that were left over from malformed creation. A lot of cosmologies associate them with demons and with evil spirits. And when you go through Doth, you'll be tempted by them the same way Jesus was tempted in the desert. And crossing it over requires a strict discipline and understanding and balance between opposite forces and harmony. Think about how difficult it is to plan orbital trajectories. If you're off by 1 degree, you could end up going to Mars instead of the moon. And if you're not prepared to go to Mars, and you only have enough supplies for the moon, you might be out of luck. So that's why crossing Doth, the Archons are actually serving a divine duty in the sense that they're gatekeeping this higher level of creative aspects of reality that are within all of consciousness. Jesus said the law is written on every man's heart within. The kingdom of heaven is within, not without. So, wrapping this back around to point number 5. Doth is this valley. It's that going within. It's that very deep, deep depth within. Yep. Alright, point number 6. Central to the theme of this channel is data. So why is data important? Well, data has 3 of the 4 letters that are also in Doth. Think about that. But, no, on a serious note, data is a means to acquire the experience and the immersion in Doth. Data and data analysis, think about it as retrospection or introspection. People who spend a little bit of time introspecting don't end up in bad spots as often as people who lack introspection. I'm sure you guys can come up with plenty of examples in your life where a little bit of thinking about what you were about to say will go a long way. You know, Sam Hyde, not to quote Sam Hyde on a lot of things, but he did say one thing that's very important, and that is you'll never regret not saying something. You'll never regret keeping your mouth shut. There's maybe 1 or 2, maybe 3 times in your entire life where you need to speak up, and you'll know it. But most of the time you can go without getting the last word. Another very important piece of wisdom that he gave is don't mythologize your suffering. So you as a 1 in 7 billion little ant in this anthill of human life and human civilization, you're not important in the cosmic sense, at least in a mythological sense. And so don't mythologize your suffering just means that you don't want to perceive yourself and your identity as in this fixed cage. If you think of yourself as a perpetual victim, you'll always be a perpetual victim. And this goes back to my first core thesis of this channel, which is make sure you curate beliefs that serve you and not the other way around. Now, it actually might be quite self-serving to believe that you are this kind of perpetual victim, and because that's what's lifted up in, I guess, today's society to an extent. But I'll tell you, you get much more utilization out of life by being in charge rather than being what the current flavor of the month is in the social hierarchy game. So back to the main point. Data as a means for introspection and retrospection. Data as a means to ascend the tree. What's very interesting is this is a Buddhist teaching. The seed is no different than the tree. So in Buddhism, everything is a process. Things don't actually exist in the way that we, in a Western materialistic kind of sense, conceive them. So we'll point to the floor and we'll say, yeah, there's definitely some concrete slabs on the floor here. You know, we'll point to a tree and we'll say, yeah, there's definitely a tree branch made out of wood there. point to a car and say, yeah, there's definitely a car there. But the only thing that we can really say is that at this temporal slice in time, there is whatever there is there. So there isn't a car there now. See, it's empty. And in 1,000 years from now, all of these trees around me probably won't be there. And so that's what the Buddhists are getting at. It's really only from your individual time slice, 3D plus one whatever dimension for time, that you can even assert things are or things exist. And they get a little picky on the word exist as well. But that's why they say the seed is no different than the tree, because the entire tree exists in that state of potentiality as a seed. And again, and this is another kind of teaching, this is the really kind of inspirational part, is that the tree can produce boundless seeds. Boundless. One seed can produce one tree, but one tree can produce a multitude of seeds. And that is a very divine teaching there. It's a very subtle teaching that and this is where the Bible also mentions the mustard seed, how great is wisdom that falls upon ears to hear it. How great is it that the teachings fall upon fecundant soil that bears multiple fruit. And also the opposite of that, when Jesus cursed the fig tree that bore no fruit after 2 or so years. When divine wisdom falls upon your ears, you ought to take it and run with it. Take it as far and as exciting as you can, as Basher would say, or Daryl, whichever one that is. He's got a lot of good insight as well. So, this is why I'm such an advocate for meditation, and also taking good notes during your meditations and afterward your meditation. Because I can tell you what I was doing pretty much any day that I have notes for it. I can't tell you what I had for breakfast, 10 years ago. But I can if it was 3 years ago. I can tell you I had exactly 3 eggs and 3 egg whites, a little cup of avocado, however many slices of toast, and then 4 or 5 slices of French toast with cocoa powder, anabolic French toast. Thanks, Coach Greg. But taking notes will vastly accelerate your learning, your progression, your capacity, and your experience as well. Because data, your brain is just a big data archive. All it does is retrieve, store, load, store, retrieve, store, process new input, see how it reacts in the world, store that data. When you keep track of these things, signals will become much more crisp and clear. They look at wine tasting. People think there's wine snobs, wine tasters are wine snobs, But I'm personally not an expert at tasting wine, but I do believe that there probably is a very fine level of tastes and palates that you can acquire. It's almost like how a master artist can differentiate between different colors through practice. Same thing with sound. Master pianists. People can hear music and recreate the entire scale that was made to produce that music. So, data is key to accelerating your progress. One example is the different types of fun. Type 1 fun. Wow, that was fun. That was good. I'm going to do it again. Type 2 fun was, wow, that was fun. I'm probably not going to do it again, but that was all right. Type 3 fun is, wow, that wasn't fun. I'm not going to do it again. And keeping track of those kinds of experiences you have in life will make you much more capable of discriminating between the different types of fun. So that way you don't have to repeat those kinds of type 3 fun experiences. You know, I don't know how many times you have to hit yourself on the hand hammering in a nail with a hammer before you realize that you should probably use a screwdriver, because it's not a nail, it's a screw, and you can't hammer a screw in. You gotta use a screwdriver. You'll find that there's a lot of teachings and lessons in life that are exactly like that. You're using the wrong tool for the wrong job. You should be on the beach with a margarita, bathing in the sun, appreciating life. And the only way you can appreciate life is through death, or Doth. Thanks for watching. If you guys stuck around to the end, leave a comment, leave a like. Let me know what you guys want to see next, and maybe I'll make a video about it. See ya.